There's so much we have not been told about history. Most Americans don't really study Russian history, the history of the Soviet Union. They know their World War II history, but even a lot of that, the way it was taught to us, there was a lot of lying by omission, maybe. There
Hmm.
was so much that we weren't told, and Russia's incredible sacrifice in that war. They're they they beat the Nazis. It wasn't us. It wasn't Great Britain. It wasn't the French. It was the Russians. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday. It ties into where we are now. We talked about a secret plan that the Allies had towards the end of the war called Operation Unthinkable. And I don't know how many of you out there have ever heard of this. I hadn't until the late 90s when the documents were finally declassified by the British government of a plan that Winston Churchill and the British Armed Forces cooked up. It was the craziest idea ever to either, you could say they were starting World War III or maybe looking to prolong World War II. World War II could have gone on for another 10, 15, 20 years if this plan had actually gone into operation. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, and best of all, Winston Churchill lost the election in 1945, and the new government wanted no part of this. They did not want to attack the Soviet Union. They did not want to get into a full-blown war with Russia. Probably wise.
Hmm.
But we were about to, had Winston Churchill had his way. World War II might have gone on another 10 years, wiped out all the goodwill that the Allies had. If we had turned around and stabbed our ally, the Soviet Union, in the back after they had won this amazing victory for us, protecting us from the Nazis, then we would be no better than Hitler. That's exactly what Hitler did to Stalin in 1941. He turned on his ally and invaded his country. We were going to do that. They were seriously talking about doing this. And I sent a video to you that I thought we could play because I think people need to know about Operation Unthinkable. It almost happened, folks, and history could have turned out very differently. And it tells the story of how the British Armed Forces and Churchill were working with the SS and the Wehrmacht to team up and go into Russia at the end of the war. It's
We've,
stunning. It'll
I
blow
have,
your mind. If you didn't know, this will absolutely blow your mind.
I do have that queued up and ready to rock and roll here. We'll run some of that for you when we come back after this break to show you how the Western allies at that time were even thinking of possibly using nuclear weapons in that operation and how they were prepared to repurpose Nazi soldiers in that effort had it come to pass. Stay with us. More right after this.
Maverick News. The world is watching.
The New World Order. Government overreach. The Great Reset. mainstream media lies. Now more than ever, independent voices are needed. Donate now, at freedomreporters.com. That's freedomreporters.com. Maverick News. The antivirus program. For your mind.
And we're back. So we have this documentary queued up that kind of explains what Lori has been talking about.
Yeah, just a quick 10-minute history lesson. Stick around. You'll find this interesting.
Yeah, more than interesting. Chilling, actually.
Not yet the end. In February of 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Premier Joseph Stalin met in Crimea in what would be known as the Yalta Conference to discuss the reorganization of Europe after the war ended. The meeting's goal was not only to discuss collective security, but also to reincorporate the liberated nations into Europe and provide them with self-determination. The Allies had liberated France and Belgium and were currently engaged against the Germans in the West. Meanwhile, the Soviets had removed the Nazis from Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria on the other front. The war's outcome was clear, and now the focus was on re-establishing peace. However, each of the three heads of state had a private agenda. Roosevelt required Soviet support against Japan for the incoming invasion and their participation in the United Nations. Churchill demanded democratic governments and free elections for all countries in Eastern and Central Europe, especially Poland. And Stalin impelled a sphere of political influence in Eastern and Central Europe, claiming it was a matter of national security for the Soviets. The Russian mandatory was also keenly interested in Poland, given its historical use as a corridor by invaders approaching Mother Russia. Stalin would state that, quote, "For the Soviet government, the question of Poland was one of honor. Because the Russians had greatly sinned against Poland, the Soviet government was trying to atone for those sins. The Soviet Union is interested in the creation of a mighty, free, and independent Poland." Still, the Soviets would keep the territory they had annexed from eastern Poland in 1939, and in exchange, Poland would receive a territorial expansion to the west at the expense of Germany. Despite the Soviet-sponsored provisional government in Poland and the country's Red Army occupation, the communist leader promised them free elections. However, even as the agreement was signed on paper, the Soviets were more interested in creating puppet states and did not let go of their area of influence as promised. Churchill was wary of communism expanding across Europe and into the English Isles, and wrote to his foreign secretary, quote, "Terrible things have happened. A tide of Russian domination is sweeping forward. It is to an early and speedy showdown and settlement with Russia that we must now turn our hopes." A ludicrous idea. A few days before the conflict ended, the British Prime Minister summoned his chiefs of staff. Churchill wanted assurance that the Allied forces could confront the Red Army, and inquired whether they could potentially push back the Russians from the River Elbe. Furthermore, Churchill demanded that a plan be laid out, taking into account what was left of Germany's economy, workforce, and troops. A date was then settled for the beginning of the assault. It would take place on July 1st, 1945. However, Chief of the Army General Sir Alan Brooke disapproved of the plan. Likening the Prime Minister to a warmonger, Brooke wrote in his diary that Churchill was, quote, "longing for another war." Meanwhile, U.S. General George S. Patton seemed to agree with the British Prime Minister. Patton allegedly advised Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson to keep the American army positioned in Europe and bordering the Soviet lines. If the Russians didn't withdraw, he advocated to push them back in the name of Eastern Europe's freedom. Patton claimed that, quote, "We did not come over here to acquire jurisdiction over either the people or their countries. We came to give them back the right to govern themselves. We must either finish the job now, while we are here and ready, or later in less favorable circumstances." However, the politicians in Washington and the American soldiers still in the European theater were exhausted, and only wanted everyone to be back home after such an unfathomable war. And there was still the need for forces in the Pacific for the invasion of Japan. Churchill became highly concerned that the Allied withdrawal would grant the Soviets a strong position, especially in Western Europe. In May of 1945, the British Armed Forces Joint Planning Staff presented a plan known as Operation Unthinkable. first draft called for a surprise attack on the Soviets stationed in Germany. The assessment concluded that the British and American morale was still high, and the Allies counted on the support of Polish and German forces. The main objective was, quote, to impose upon Russia the will of the United States and the British Empire. The Allies strived to get a fair deal for Poland, which the Joint Planning Staff believed might force the Russians to abide by Allied terms. However, it was just as possible that that wouldn't be the case, and the report stated that, quote, it is for the Russians to decide. If they want total war, they are in a position to have it. Operation Unthinkable. The British Prime Minister stood his ground, and with good reason. He was aware that his allies were getting successful results from the Manhattan Project, and that a nuclear attack on Moscow, Stalingrad, or Kiev was imminent if Stalin did not comply. The plan called for a surprise attack on Dresden with 47 Allied divisions. This amounted to almost half the divisions available to the British, American, and Canadian forces. However, the Chiefs of Staff Committee found the idea unfeasible, as Soviet land forces had an advantage of 2.5 to 1 in Europe and the Middle East. Even with the entire American, British, and Polish forces, in addition to the repurposed German prisoners of war, success would depend on the surprise element alone. And it was also believed that Russia could have made an alliance with the Japanese, as the Pacific War was not over yet. Therefore, an offensive operation was considered too risky. Stalin was aware of the British intentions through his spy network in London, and it became evident that an offensive was being put into place when Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was ordered to stockpile captured German weaponry, quote, for future use. In June of 1945, senior Soviet commander Marshal Georgy Zhukov abruptly ordered a regrouping of Soviet forces in Poland, assuming defensive positions. It was then likely that Moscow knew about the operation, but it could also be that the Soviets distrusted the Western Allies and were just being wary. Still, if the Russians knew about the Allied plans, there would be no surprise element, crushing their chances to succeed. Operation Unthinkable had too many shortcomings, and the report warned that, quote, if we are to embark on war with Russia, we must be prepared to be committed to a total war, which would be both long and costly. The Prime Minister received a draft copy by early June and realized that support from the American forces would be indispensable, but it could not be guaranteed. The British mandatory then concluded that the operation was, quote, purely hypothetical contingency. Churchill then requested a follow-up report on measures that would, quote, ensure the security of the British Isles in the event of war with Russia in the near future. A defensive response was then prepared, but the report concluded that Britain's odds were unfavorable, given the US's primary focus on the Pacific theater. After the change of administration in the US, President Harry S. Truman was clear that America would not take part in Operation Unthinkable, halting any chances of success. Furthermore, the Joint Planning Staff was against the Prime Minister's wish to retain bridgeheads in continental Europe, as they would not result in any operational advantage. And although Britain's Navy and Air Force were superior to the Soviets, there was fear that they could retaliate with a massive rocket attack. Aftermath. While Churchill was right to distrust the Soviet premier, the entire operation was buried for good after his electoral defeat in 1945. However, concerns about the Soviet expansion prompted the American military authorities to revise the initial idea only a year later. But increasing tensions between the Allies and the Soviets in Europe compelled the top American leaders to reconsider whether Operation Unthinkable was a feasible strategy, or the creation of a distressed mind in power for too long. Still, a wider conflict could be triggered, and the matter was officially reopened on August 30th, 1946, with General Dwight Eisenhower advocating for a withdrawal to the Low Countries because of their proximity to the British territories. Operation Unthinkable is considered the first contingency plan of the Cold War era, and the plot was so secret that it wasn't fully disclosed until 1998, well after the fall of the Soviet Union.